Hi, this is Lili Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thanks for joining me for this extra podcast on some Book of Mormon ideas. I have my daughter, Caitlin Justiniano, with me, visiting from Mesa. Caitlin
Thanks,
came up
Mom.
for the birthday weekend, which, kind of tender without Chris, so I'm really grateful. And some of the other family gathered, and there's a story to tell there that I will tell probably on the next podcast, but I'm not going to do that right now because I just wanted Caitlin to share some things that we've talked about as we've been going through the Book of Mormon this year and just talking about what's going on in the world. So she had an idea that I have really liked, and I've actually shared it, on the side with clients and friends and things like that. I always give her credit because I don't think I really had keyed in on this at all myself, and yet it seems so applicable to what people are going through today, what we're all going through today, and I wanted to share it. But first, there are actually kind of three things that I've asked Caitlin to talk about today, and we'll see where this goes. But the first one is maybe the shortest idea, but kind of a tender, a personal one to me, and I'm grateful to Caitlin for her insight on this one. Caitlin had come up also in August for what would have been Chris's and my 50th anniversary. And we went to the temple that day and did some initiatory, and then we were sitting in the celestial room. And I think I've mentioned before that I've had kind of a spiritual numbness, and I know that God is there, and I have seen evidences of his love, but it hasn't, there has been a period of time where it has felt remote. And I understand that. I understand there are parts of the wilderness that we feel alone, even though it's not in actuality the case. God is with us. Christ is with us, but we may not always sense that he's there. And that has been part of my experience during this year. And anyway, when we were in the celestial room, I was praying and I was really pleading for some feeling from God. I wanted to feel his love. I wanted to sense it in ways that I've sensed it before. And I waited a while, and I prayed a while, and I didn't really get the kind of feeling that I had hoped for. Couldn't stay there all day, so eventually, I said we could get going, and we went down to the dressing room and got changed for leaving the temple. And as we were leaving the dressing room, there were, I think it was 3 temple workers, sisters there in the dressing room. And I think at least 1 or 2 patrons that were also there. I apologize, my dogs are not locked up today because of the way we're doing this. So they're gonna give us a little ambient noise. But anyway, these 3 temple workers and a couple of patrons sort of came one by one, but all of a sudden there was a collection of sisters around us, and they told me that they were listening to the podcast and that they appreciated it. And I introduced Caitlin and mentioned that we were there because it was Chris's and my 50th anniversary. And there were so many tender expressions of kindness and love and hugs from those sisters as we left. It was very touching. But as we went out to the car, I told Caitlin, said, I know that was a sweet blessing from our Heavenly Father, but it wasn't what I had asked for. Anyway, Caitlin made a great observation. I'm going to ask her to share that with you and talk about that just a little bit.
So I've been talking about this for a while because I have thought about it in my life and situations that we've had. And I don't know where it hit. Probably someone made a comment in Relief Society one day about love languages. And I think that there's a lot of danger in predetermining the conditions with which we see love. Love language is all about deciding or identifying our kind of love, right? So this is how I like to be loved. This is how I show love. And while I get that there are some good points to that, how often after that are we disappointed that loved ones don't show us love how we want to be loved?
That was exactly what it was. I think you said something like, I don't think it works very well to hold God to a certain love language or something very on topic, very kind, but it was exactly applicable because I mean, I was asking for a certain kind of love. I was hoping to feel what I have felt other times, and I didn't get that. And I didn't feel like God, I didn't turn away and say like, well, then I guess God doesn't love me. It just was that I had this sort of ache inside for something that I had hoped for that had not come. And then I had this beautiful outpouring of love there from those sweet sisters in the temple, and still felt the ache, felt grateful for that. But it was just a really, I thought, wonderful perspective that like sometimes we do expect that people will know our love language, and God knows our love languages, but He wants us to recognize love in all forms. And Caitlin and I have talked about this too, because over the years I've seen this with clients over for many years, even before I was a counselor. Sometimes when I was just teaching gospel doctrine, people would come in various wards, and people would come and say like, I just don't feel the love of God. I just don't. I've never had a prayer answered, or I've never felt His love. And Caitlin has had friends or associates that have also mentioned that to her about themselves or family members or so on. And it's really, I don't want to spend the whole time on that. I'll talk more about that as we go. But I think that my answer has always been God's love is there. It's how are we picking it up? Again, are we holding Him to a certain kind of manifestation? If He doesn't speak in this way, I won't hear Him. And not deliberately necessarily, not that we're trying to shut Him out, but we end up shutting Him out. And as I said, there are times where God kind of withdraws a little bit to let us stretch or have our season in the valley of the shadow. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
Does He just not love us on our terms? But it's the same thing with the teaching us the gospel and giving us trials and afflictions. They're not on our terms. They never are. Because would we choose to grow the way that God needs us to grow? All of those things are connected, because we're never going to ask for the hardest thing. I don't believe I would anyway. I'm sure there's people that are better out there than I am, that are like, bring it, God, and I will thrive in it. And I'm not that person.
Well,
But
I don't know people like that either. Maybe, but I guess what
I'm sure there's
I do think
exceptions.
maybe we agreed to some of these trials before, and people have asked me about that. And that's a Neil Maxwell idea that I think probably we did at some level without knowing all the details of pre-earth life. But in this life, we see through a glass darkly. So there's no way we see it coming. There's no way
Neil
Go ahead.
Maxwell also said, like, I expect that sometimes, like, we're not exclaiming with joy with what we're dealing with. And he excused that with permission.
Yeah.
So it's, I mean, there are a lot of levels to that, but I just think, again, like, it's the same thing. We don't, like, even though we did agree to those at a different time, we had a completely different understanding. And now we don't see trials in God's perspective, and we aren't excited for them most of the time. And we don't look for the learning lessons and applicable like parts of the gospel that, oh, I needed to learn that this way. And I mean, Maxwell talks a lot about that too, and saying that, we're grateful for it after the fact, but it is really hard in the moment with all of these things. Yes, if we do it right, if we learn how we're supposed to.
We can become bitter. We can become resentful. Those things are always temptations when we are struggling or in a lot of pain or in the midst of trials. I do think that a lot of this comes back to what scriptures have said again and again. One of the summaries is Mosiah 3:19, where it talks about conquering the natural man, of course, putting off the natural man, becoming a saint through the atonement of Jesus Christ. Anyway, it goes to this list of wonderful qualities and ends with willing to submit to all things that the Father seeth fit to inflict upon us. Not a pleasant term, but I think we have felt that, and I think it's okay. I will mention one thing that came up in a conversation with someone the other day that, anyway, it reminded me of a time when I was in one ward teaching gospel doctrine, and there was an elderly gentleman there who was very enthusiastic, and we were talking about trials and the growth that can come from there. And he said, I always tell people, if you don't have a trial, pray for one, because that's the way you're going to grow. I did say, I'm not going to go that far. I'll be honest with you. I'm not going to pray for trials because there will be plenty. And as you said, what God sees that we need, what somehow, he has this customized curriculum. Again, that's a Neil Maxwell phrase of part of our journey, has to include that kind of growth. And as I have said so many times on this podcast, the true tragedy of life is not suffering, it's wasting or suffering. It's becoming bitter and resentful, or just holding our breath and putting our head down and hoping to get through it sooner rather than later, and not taking the opportunity to learn, to grow, to become softened, to be humbled, and to increase in our submission to God and his supremacy, and being willing to bow as Christ did before the Father, to do what was required, and to trust that all the blessings that were promised would be fulfilled in the right time, the right place, and with an overflowing generosity that more than makes up for our grief. I'm really looking forward to that day. So, anyway.
And I think another part of that, though, is, to just make God's terms our terms. To come to that point. Sorry?
How do you mean?
Well, just that we accept that God recognize what he's giving as the love that we need right then, and figure out why we need it that way.
So aligning our will with the Father's, which really is the ultimate use of agency, right? To give our agency to God and say, you can do this your way, and I will acknowledge it as the best path for me, with all the heartbreak, stumbling blocks, troubles, and recognize that all of this is part of the refiner's fire, that the Lord chastens those whom he loves. And if we are willing to accept that without rebellion or bitterness, then he can make something of us. Otherwise, we're pretty tough to work with. The next thing that I wanted Caitlin to talk about, and this one is honestly, maybe the one I've been quoting the most recently to people that I talk with, is from Jacob 5. And I think I've been really tempted sometimes to mention this in the podcast, but then I thought, no, I want Caitlin to talk about this because she brought it to my attention recently, this year, and we've been discussing it or referring to it a lot as the world has unfolded, and things are tough in some interestingly new ways. Let me tie this in a little bit to what we've just been talking about the last few weeks with the chapters of Helaman and now the early chapters of 3rd Nephi, that there were so many dissensions in the church, and there was a lot of iniquity in the church. And Helaman laments this. Mormon, who is condensing these records, mentions it many times, but Helaman kind of testifies of this, and also Nephi, that we brought this on ourselves, the troubles in the church, the Lamanite wars and so much of the destruction that happened, but also just the unrest, the Gadianton robbers becoming powerful and getting into the government and so on, that so much of this was a reflection of contentious attitudes and dissensions in the church, even arguing over points of doctrine and so on. And I've mentioned, as you all know, some of the things that as I quoting someone that my son Harper heard, microphones have become way too cheap. For $100 you can set up a podcast pretty much. And so we have all these voices that are now out there, and mine is one of them. And I hope I try to keep things grounded, but boy, there are so many voices that there are lots of contentions about points of doctrine, the history of the church, about the prophets of the church, what's going on what has gone on in the past, what's going on now. Anyway, so why don't you set this up in Jacob 5? We're not going to go through the whole allegory here of the olive orchard, right? But as you all remember, this is the Lord who is the owner of this vineyard or olive orchard, and he has a servant who is working it, and they do lots of things to try to bring forth good fruit. So go ahead and...
Well, they're grafting, right? And burning and grafting and digging at the roots and doing all of those things, right?
Moving things all over the place to try to get good fruit.
And to have it all be good. So this year when I read it, it really hit me in a different way. Verses 49 through 51. It says, "And it came to pass that the Lord of the vineyard said unto the servant, Let us go to and hew down the trees of the vineyard and cast them into the fire, that they shall not cumber the ground of my vineyard. For I have done all. What could I have done more for my vineyard?" So this is Christ, right? Saying, what can I have done more for my vineyard? But behold, the servant said unto the Lord of the vineyard, and the servant is the prophet, right? That's how it's been defined. But he says, spare it a little longer. So the prophet says, hold on, just let a little more come. And the Lord said, Yea, I will spare it a little longer, for it grieveth me that I should lose the trees of my vineyard. Okay, so we're going to wait this out a little while because I want everybody that can to be able to come if they will.
And bring
Right?
forth the fruit that he wants to
and get this good fruit
serve.
that's worthwhile fruit, right?
So let's talk about that for a second, because anyway, and I know you're going to apply this more, but just, it's pretty corrupt. That's why the Lord is saying, okay, let's just cut it down and burn it, because it's gone kind of crazy. Things are crazy and we're not getting much good fruit anymore. So I think we can just call it. And then, as has often been discussed, that the servant of the vineyard or the prophet is saying, give us just another little season. Okay, go on.
Well, so we're not reading more verses here, right?
Well, maybe we'll refer to a few, but yes, go ahead and make the application.
So my thought is that that's where we are in life right now. As we see the rules changing for the strength of youth pamphlet, as we are wondering what is going on and why we're in a place in the culture of the church that not everything is so hardline defined. What if this is the prophet saying, bring them all in and let them come for a spell and we'll see? I mean, it's always been, come as you are, don't stay as you are, right? But let's bring them in and do what we can to get everybody a fair chance.
So this gathering that President Nelson has been emphasizing so much lately, let's gather. We invite all, deny none. So everyone is welcome as they are, but not with the intention that they stay as they are. And yet, as we see, I mean, come on, you guys have all heard this, right? And maybe you have felt it yourself. I think, I know I felt it. And we've talked about this with a lot of our family members, that there's kind of an expectations amongst some of the members. When are they going to lay down the law? When are they going to say that, like, no, I mean, we really do have to hold to certain standards? Or, I mean, someone asked me the other day, and I was actually going to write this out and I didn't, but someone had sent me a message about brides who are going to the temple with dresses that they don't wear for the ceiling, because now you can't wear a wedding dress for the ceiling, right? And why did they do that? Because there were too many wedding dresses that were coming that couldn't even cover the garment. And you might remember, if you're a little bit older, that there were cover-ups that the temple workers would offer that would, lift up a really low neck or cover a plunging backline, or, if there were spaghetti straps or something that wouldn't cover the garment correctly, they had these ready there in the bride's room because so many dresses came in that weren't appropriate to cover the garment. So, and I remember friends that worked in the bride's room sometimes as temple workers and would say, it's not just the girls that complain. A lot of times it's their mothers who are complaining that it ruins the look, to put these cover-ups on that needed to be there in order for them to appropriately wear the garment. So that law, the rules changed on that a long time ago now, saying just wear your temple dress. We're not going to do wedding dresses in the ceiling, because that way the temple dress will be appropriate. But what now we're seeing, and somebody commented to me recently, but we've heard this so many times, is that they leave the temple to go take pictures in their wedding dress, and sometimes they just leave the garments behind because they can't wear them with the wedding dress. They just made covenants that they're not going to keep while the photographer is taking pictures of the bridal party or at the reception. And sometimes they're leaving even the garments, they're not even disposing of them correctly. They're throwing them in the trash. So some of the temple workers are apparently getting to the point now where they just ask the brides, are you going to take your garments with you or not, so that they can at least dispose of them correctly the first time rather than pull them out of the trash and have to take care of them later? So people wonder, when are they going to just draw the line and say, this isn't appropriate? If you're going to make this covenant, make the covenant and make a commitment. And is there going to be some enforcement? Or, as you mentioned, the For Strength of Youth pamphlet that so many people have, and you have a cool story about this, but about, well, did all these standards change? Is it not so important anymore about the piercings or their tats or the bikinis or the, whatever we're wearing or doing, media and all those choices? So go ahead and talk about that great story.
Okay, but first of all, I think that you missed a little bit there, because the inserts, when I got married, it wasn't just to cover the straps that were showing. It was actually to go to fill the temple dress. Because there were plenty of temple dresses that were modest and fit garments, but it still wanted to go up to the neck and down to the sleeve. So there's a little bit,
okay, fair enough. The cover-up was sometimes for that purpose, not just because of immodesty.
I believe that is actually the original intent.
Probably.
Like, it was used other ways, but those temple dresses that were modest but didn't fit the temple dress.
Nice clarification.
Okay, I think that's fair. But all right, so with the For Strength of Youth, as soon as that got changed, I was actually in Young Women's in a ward at the time, and the first Sunday that Young Women met after President Elder Uchtdorf now announced the new changes for the For Strength of Youth pamphlet, there were a couple girls in the class right then that said, "Oh, my friend is getting a CTR tattoo now, and we can wear bikinis now." And I said, that's not really what this is. This is an opportunity to live a higher law and figure out what God really wants for you. And it kind of fell. There was really no response besides that. And then even the next week in Gospel Doctrine, parents were basically saying the same thing, that it's an opportunity not to judge. And this is just like us easing up and kind of just fitting in with the world a little bit more.
Yeah, so that's been a lot of the feeling. It's definitely been a lot of the feeling. And so it has seemed to be, and then with the no dress standards at FSY this year, people have felt like, well, yeah, things are loosening up, and it's not as big a deal as it was, apparently, because these things
it gives opportunities for other cultures to blend in, and we don't want to judge those cultures because they have tattoos. Okay, and that's true. But this was never about judging between us and other people. This was about us and God and how we are with God. And that's always where it's supposed to be. It's really never been about what your neighbor is doing or what another culture is doing. So that's the first place to start. Let me just
throw in too that, and you listeners have heard me say this before, that I like to distinguish between judging and condemning. And not that we should be going around rating our neighbors, for sure, as Caitlin's saying, but just that we can make judgments about what we feel is appropriate or not, but not condemn an individual. We don't know all the things that are going on, how much they've been taught, what they've learned, what's going on. We leave all that to God. So and you're absolutely right. It's never been about that. These standards were never so that we could hold up some kind of magnifying glass to everyone around us and say, you pass and you don't, but that we could look at ourselves and see how we are living in a way that is acceptable or pleasing unto God, trying to lift ourselves to a status of being his people, his peculiar treasure. A point I've made many times before is that no matter what the pamphlet says, if we look at the context of the gospel of Jesus Christ and all of the scriptures that we have, God has never told his people, be more like Babylon, blend in, be indistinguishable, let us just be like everyone else. That's never been his message, and it never will be his message. And yet it's interesting how quickly so many people did see it as it doesn't matter so much. Now we can sort of enjoy, quote unquote, a little bit more of Babylon, more of the world. And I'm not trying to say that they went from 0 to 60 in evil ways necessarily, but certainly there was a lessening of some of the things that have set us apart from the world. Okay, keep going.
And I heard that from friends too, that they would hear the same comments in their ward. So I know that this is definitely a common consensus. Even, me and my little corner of the world did try and speak up, and it was not significant to most people. But also at the same time, we had these new changes come out. 1 month later, Elder Uchtdorf was at Luke Air Force Base, and my husband is active duty there right now. And he invited all active duty to come and meet him one night. So most of the night was a Q&A, and we didn't know that ahead. So he just said, "What questions do you have?" And one of the youth raised her hand and asked, "What advice would you give to the youth to thrive?" basically. And he put down his microphone and actually started shuffling through his wallet and said, "I'm looking for both of them, looking for both of them." And I kind of stopped looking eventually, but he held up one of the pamphlets and said, "Look, if you live by both the old," and he didn't say it, the old, he said, but the new pamphlet, and how did he say it? The former and the updated versions of these pamphlets. If you live by both of these, you are going to be successful in life. And he said it a few times right there. And I mean, it wasn't a one-time thing. And I was like, "Did you hear that, kids? Elbowing my kids, make sure, like, that part right there." I mean, I've got 3 boys and a girl, and I want them all to embrace this still for the standards for what they are intended to be, to keep us apart from the world and keep us closer to God. But so him mentioning that a few times, and I'm like, that's it. What we have to do is make sure that we know what we're doing is right. And it is an invitation to live a higher law through this new pamphlet, right?
And maybe live it in a higher way, I would say, because it's, as he was indicating there, it's interesting because Elder Uchtdorf is the one who presented the new pamphlet in conference to the church. And he didn't say that there. So it's kind of interesting that he said it to your group of Air Force families there at Luke. But he was so clear about it, mentioning it several times. And it seems to me like it is sort of he who has ears to hear. And honestly, going through the new pamphlet, I remember checking some things about like piercings and tattoos and things like that. And it really did say all the same basic principles. Your body is a temple. It's the temple of your spirit. Think very carefully, be very cautious about doing things that are permanent to alter your body. Anyway, honestly, it was pretty much the same thing, but it just wasn't spelled out. That means no tats. That means, and yes, there's some cultural sensitivity there, because we do have members who come from cultures where tattoos are part of their heritage and things like that. And again, it's not about condemning anybody, and it might, embrace that with a little more comfort, but it's not saying, now let's blend in with the rest of the world. Your body is still a temple. It always has been. Be aware of that. So I love that he made that point and repeated it there to that group. I'm sure he has done that with some other groups where he's said, live by both of them. So even though it's not spelled out, it's still there. It's still there. And that's the higher way of looking at it, is to say, well, we've talked about this a lot too. President Nelson keeps saying, hear him. And this is a higher way to get there rather than being commanded in all things.
Isn't this the same thing with ministering? If you break down exactly ministering, it's that we don't have these rules anymore, and they're not supposed to be a checklist. Now, if you look at what the members have done with ministering, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I saw them in the hall and they're good," and then Elder Gong says, "Oh, funny enough, more people think that they're actually ministering than to people than people actually think they've been ministered to." Right. Yeah. So we have this because it's unclear now. The guidelines are unclear, and people are like they want to.
Yeah.
And it's not specified in exactly the same way. And this is where the same thing applies with President Nelson to both of these things, saying we cannot survive spiritually without a personal connection to God. I mean, I actually have that quote somewhere here, but the point being that we really have to figure out for ourselves what this means. And ministering has been redefined for us to the intent with Elder Holland's talk, then Elder Holland, now President Holland, was that we find a higher living to it, right? He mentions the friend that was there and the one that they called because he was a friend, not because he was the home teacher. And that's the intent there. So if we look at the For Strength of Youth pamphlet, what was the intent? Same thing you said. All the verbiage is there. Like, are we going to choose to live by it or not? And it is up to us, right?
Yeah. up to us to get that confirmation, but to not, again, I think that the sad thing is that so often, and I don't want to condemn the whole membership of the church here, because we do see a lot of people who are concerned about these things and they are trying to find their way, and I really applaud that. I think I've told a story about a young woman who saw me at a presentation I was giving, and she came afterwards and said, I heard you on your podcast talking about, that this isn't God has never said be more like Babylon. And I was praying about getting extra piercings. And I knew that was my answer, which was so sweet that she was looking for that answer. She was praying. She went to the Lord, and then she felt that she was guided to recognize that idea when it was shared. And it could have been anybody who shared it, but she heard it. And that is more growth for her than if it were just spelled out in black and white. Don't do this, and then don't do this. And as we were talking about preparing for Zion, this does give us the chance, just like you said with ministering, or is it just okay, now I don't have to report, so I can kind of, do less or ease up. And again, obviously situations vary, seasons vary. This isn't about trying to impose guilt on people who are at a different stage or trying to adjust to where they are, but have a good intent. But it is interesting that so often it is seen as like, oh, if it's not going to be spelled out in black and white, or if it's not, I don't have to report exactly on numbers or visits or whatever, then there can be this letdown that isn't really growth towards Zion. It's really not preparing, as President Nelson keeps telling us, for this higher and holier life. And that is Zion.
So we can see those trends. And when I was telling actually Angela, my sister-in-law, Graydon's wife, about the comment that Elder Uchtdorf made with the both, she said, well, why didn't he tell that to everybody? Mm-hmm. And I think because she's like, it seems like a lot of people forgot, didn't hear that. That's not, and I said, well, because he's said it so many times already. It's there if we want to know. And the writing has been on the wall for so long that if you're going to seek and find it out, is God going to limit that personal revelation? Absolutely not. Like the girl that, was wondering about the extra piercings.
And went to God.
Yes. And if you actually go to God and ask about any of these things, if you really want to pray with about your choice in swimsuits or your daughter's choice in swimsuits, what answer do you think God's going to give?
Yeah.
And try it. Because God wants us to have that personal revelation. The whole gospel is based on personal revelation. Yeah. And it will never go against what the prophets say. But we are to get that witness ourselves.
And how often do we, review Heber C. Kimball's statement that the day will come when no man can stand in borrowed light? That's what you're talking about too.
Which goes exactly along with President Nelson saying, and I have the quote right here, in coming days, it will not be possible to survive spiritually without the guiding, directing, comforting, and constant influence of the Holy Ghost. Yeah. So all of these things are setting us up to seek and to learn and to know and to test it ourselves. Let alone all the trials everybody's having at this point too, right? Because that's the other place that it applies to all the time. But if you want to know the standards and you want to know if you're really going to obey this, then if you want to be an all in, if it's the right thing, every time you go, you're going to find out, and you're going to increase your ability to get personal revelation and feel the Spirit and be guided, right? So he's opening that up for everybody.
And not discounting at all. And this is exactly what you're saying. I'm just repeating it a different way, that it's in that process of seeking the will of the Lord personally, not with the attitude of how far can I go and still get away with it, but how can I please the Lord? How can I be acceptable? How can I keep my covenant in a higher holy way, as the prophet is inviting it, become Zion, qualify for sanctification and the gift of the Holy Ghost, all those things, that if we go with that kind of humble heart, seeking the will of the Lord, not can I go this far and still be acceptable? Can I go this far and still take the sacrament, still be an active member, still go to the temple? And there's a real difference there. And that's what's happening in the vineyard. It seems like to us as we talk about it, that some of the fruit, because what happens, and I did actually, when we were talking about this a moment ago, I was just kind of browsing through my phone version of Jacob 5, and let me just point out what's I'm marked.
A couple of things we found. Oh yeah, we missed those verses. Yeah.
Well, and let's catch them now. But this was before the ones that Caitlin read. where the Lord of the vineyard is saying, this is the end of verse 42, all the trees of my vineyard are good for nothing, save it to be hewn down and cast in the fire. So that's the point where things were. And then, as Caitlin described, he's like, okay, the servant is asking, give us just a little longer. I mean, there's that heartbreaking question, but the Lord says, what could I have done more in my vineyard? Because the Lord has done everything. But okay, they give him a little more time. And then the servant asked for a little longer, and then going forward, what did I catch here? Oh, yes. Verse 62. So we're jumping a little bit. Wherefore, let us go to, this is the servant calling all the other servants. Let's labor diligently. Let's do one big last push to gather anybody who will come. And they might be natural branches, and they might be grafted in, and they might be wild. But if they bring forth good fruit, we're going to, store them up to the Lord. They'll be preserved unto the Lord for the good fruit that he's seeking. So verse 62, wherefore let us go to and labor with our might this last time, for behold, the end draweth nigh. So this is before the coming of the Lord the second time. We're going to labor this last time to try to bring in everybody who will come. And they might be coming from, Timbuktu and from all corners of the world and different cultures and different ways. And they might have a lot of learning to do and growing. And that's our job, right? Is to invite all and to teach and to strengthen and to fellowship and to not to condemn and not to cast out, but to teach and to invite anyway. And then verse 64, again, just things that hit me. For the last time, he says again, for the end draweth nigh. And then verse 65, partway through, ye shall not clear away the bad thereof all at once. And this is kind of in reference to what we've been talking about. Like some people who feel like, why won't they just lay down the law? Why won't they just pound the pulpit and say like, okay, just stop doing this and get a clue about this. And we're going to just really hold the boundary lines. We're going to have standards at FSY. We're going to have standards here. We're going to spell it out. They're not doing that right now. And it does seem like it fits with exactly what Caitlin picked up this time through the Book of Mormon. It's like, wait, we're just going to really invite everybody to come from wherever they are and see if they can bring forth the tame fruit, the sweet, wonderful fruit. So when he says this, don't clear away the bad thereof all at once, lest the roots thereof should be too strong. Anyway, he's saying it's got to be this like balance. It's got to be a balance, and it's got to be sort of incremental. And then this is exactly what his standard is. Verse 66. Wherefore ye shall clear away the bad, according as the good shall grow. Like, that's on us. Like, if we're not strong enough in our commitment, in our trying to live a consecrated covenant life, and of course, line upon line, precept on precept, growing where we're able, and letting the Lord consecrate our trials for our gain. As we become stronger, as we become more fit for the kingdom, more qualified for sanctification, as we become more clear on hearing personal revelation and hearing the Lord, that's when they will clear away the bad. Because if they do it too quickly, it isn't going to be, it's not going to allow for all the maturity of fruit that God is looking for. I think that's one of the punchlines right there. And then jumping way ahead, verse 74, that at the end, where the Lord is preserving unto himself the trees that have borne natural fruit, they became like unto one body. That's the goal. That's Zion.
So a couple things there that I want to go even back to a little bit. But first of all, with the good fruit and, growing and becoming what we can, I think that we, have to remember that it's not that we want to put our kids in a situation where, oh, well, they're going to flourish because they have all this evil around them, except that we have to be diligent about teaching them lessons about the consequences that they see around them from the choices other people are making, whether or not they're in, whether they're in the church or not. We can learn from those lessons, and every kid that is convicted to the standards of the gospel, no matter at what cost, and especially at a huge cost, is going to grow in strength in their testimony, in their faith, in their knowledge, and God is going to bless that person for it. It's a sacrifice. And frankly, I kind of wish...
the muscle grows when it's stressed. The muscle grows when
Yes.
it's stressed, when you're swimming upstream, when you're against the current, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And so you're right. Your kids, all are these generations that are these younger generations that maybe are kind of puzzled at like, well, why am I, trying to wear modest clothing if nobody else is? And they might feel a
And
little odd or left out or
And I
uncool.
think even some of those girls at FSY do. And honestly, I kind of wish that they would do a couple weeks where it was, you want to abide by the old standards, come on to these 2 weeks and see if
That
those
would be
fill
really
up.
interesting. That'd be
Because
really
as
interesting.
you've said before, like the spirit's there at FSY no matter what, but would the spirit be stronger with kids that are even more obedient? Would it be like, would you, it definitely would give them a cohesiveness with like-minded people that would be a blessing to those kids that are out in the wilderness.
Which was
Because
originally the
sometimes,
idea, wasn't it? That
and
was the original
exactly,
idea of
and it
EFY
is
back
at
in
a
the day.
cost. And it is
Yep.
at a cost
There's
to
a
those
cost.
kids, those girls that are wearing the longer shorts. It's sad that they don't feel like they're part of the crowd in a
The
church
church
congregation.
sanctioned
They're
activity.
separated. And of course, again, that bitter for sweet, and they will get blessed for it. But like that strength comes in numbers when they're surrounded too. So it's a little bit hard to be like, and I do, my personal opinion on FSY standards is I wish that the clothing, little grooming and
Guideline.
clothing guideline said dress and groom in a way that you would feel comfortable if the Savior were to appear at any event.
Well, that'd be a great reminder. It'd be a great reminder.
Because isn't that what it's all about? It's about Christ.
And right now, what we are seeing is that the good, the tame, and the wild fruit, are all the branches are to grow together, and that there won't be that pruning away until the good has kind of swum upstream and has become more one in their dedication to Christ. And again, Christ isn't looking to keep people out. He's looking to bring them in, and that should be our attitude. So for the time being, we can hopefully be patient for this season and not be upset that okay, why are people getting away with stuff? We can say like, okay, but maybe there will be maybe some of these people who are kind of on the borderline, or they're not fully maybe wearing them on a dress yet for their wedding or whatever. Maybe they can like mature a little bit more and come in, and maybe they will bring in some good fruit as they continue. And I think that's what this season is. So it's not about like, why won't God just throw these people out? It's like maybe we can, as those of us who want to consecrate to the higher and holier way, if we can be an example and be kind, not wishy-washy in our own observance, and not condemning, but inviting and encouraging and trying to exemplify, because people grow up sometimes or come to Jesus, and that's what this season is all about. It's like, let's give them a little more time and hope that more will come to the Savior and make that choice, because the good are growing stronger, and as they grow stronger, some will come in and join that movement, or that group of people who are trying to become sanctified, trying to become qualified for Zion. And so it isn't about like bring out the guillotine and just start chopping off heads.
Which reminds me, okay, so when Rob and I were engaged, we had a couple interesting conversations. So Rob's a convert, joined the church in college, okay, and is the only member in his family. Very good, diligent priesthood holder. I'm very grateful for Rob. One of the conversations we had when we were engaged, well, there were two that really come into play in this conversation. So one time I told him, like I said, I think you should try starting to use thee and thy and thou in prayers. And he was like, why? It doesn't matter. God hears our prayers. Like, he's going to listen. He knows what we mean. And I said, absolutely, absolutely he does. You are, yes, you're right. But if there is a better way that shows love and respect, shouldn't we try and do that? He started using thee and thy. Yes. And so that it's not that like it makes it a prayer that God doesn't hear. And that's never been his message. But when there's a better way that gets us closer to him because we're doing what we're commanded, isn't it good? Doesn't that open up? The other conversation we had was I don't even know how this came up, but it was adoption, okay? And unwed birth mothers. And somehow this came up, and I said, okay, so what if one of our kids got pregnant? What if or as a girlfriend of a son, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, got pregnant as a teen or whatever. And he's like, no blood of mine is ever getting adopted.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, wait a second. Okay, so I'd come from working at family services with my dad for a couple of years, and I'd done all the adoption records, and I'd heard many blessings about adoption. And I know there's difficulties with it too. But as the prophet said, the best place for the best thing is if the couple can get married. If they can't, then they should.
Meaning
Yes.
that it could develop a stable, healthy marriage that hopefully would be sealed in the temple someday. That was the idea.
Right.
If that is possible, then marriage is the first choice that would be preferred. But in cases where marriage is not going to, be a good path, and probably wouldn't turn into a healthy relationship that could be sealed in the temple, then what the prophets used to say, and interestingly that they've withdrawn this counsel now, and family services stopped doing adoptions a lot of years ago.
Well, for legal reasons, but
partly, but also it was because they weren't getting very many girls that were doing that. Mm-hmm. And they were saying that the best thing would be to have that child placed in a family where the sealing would be possible. And it wasn't about who owns the child. And my point that I've probably made before, but it's been a while, is that God isn't into dividing people. He's into gathering people together into one, as he keeps telling us. So if that, let's say that pregnant teenage girl who placed her child for adoption, the stats were very clear that her likelihood of remaining active in the church, of marrying in the temple, finishing education, having a more stable, healthy, not impoverished life really rose with the placing of the child for adoption. And that was not just in the church. That was in and out of the church, that young women did better in their future lives and were less likely to end up in poverty and things like that if they placed the child for adoption. And the child, actually, the outcomes for the child were, again, statistically much better than if they stayed with a single mom, where often it was the grandparents that, anyway. And not to condemn anybody, doesn't have to condemn anybody. These are tough decisions, and people did different things. And sometimes, we pray for good outcomes for everybody, of course. But the prophets had a recommendation to give that, again, studies showed again and again were actually a blessing to everybody involved. And my contention is that, like that young girl who had a chance to, more likely to stay in the church, more likely to have a temple marriage, if she kept her covenants, she would be in the kingdom. And that child would have a good chance of being sealed, of growing up in the church, because they were placing in family services. They were placing, of course, with member families who had temple sealings. And the likelihood of that child having a stable life and being able to stay in the church and be in the kingdom, anyway, they would be together.
So all that, and I've seen very open adoptions where they've been great, and that's even brought them together on earth right now with the adoptive mother, the adoptive parents, and the birth mom, and a lot of love there.
Fulfilling ways,
wonderful ways to do it. So I think, in fact, that gives me chills thinking about the families I know that have participated in those, because that has been so wonderful for those kids that they know their birth mom, know their adoptive parents, anyway. Okay, so back to this story with Rob, though. The thing about this was, he's like, no child of mine. And I'm like, okay, but the prophet says this. And I'm like, well, would you at least pray about it? He's like, well, no. And I'm like, and he's like, I guess I'd pray about it. I'm like, wait a second. So you're going to pray about it, but you're already assuming that you know the answer? And that was my problem, where I was like, how can you expect to get a different answer? That's the question I asked. How do you expect to get a different answer if you have already decided no blood of yours is going to be in that position? Are we really opening up a line of revelation and discernment here because you've already decided? And we've not been in that situation. And I think he's, seen a lot of growth, and he understood what I was saying there. Mm-hmm, but the question, the point is that if we go in thinking that we're the exception to the rule, we're going to hear that we're the exception to the rule, even if we're not. And when we do that with standards, and we think we're like, oh, you know what? This dress is really pretty. I'm going to pray about it. Maybe God will let me wear it. Are we going to feel good about that? Maybe we will. We're predisposed, and that predisposition changes, it blocks revelation. And you can think you prayed about it, But
And maybe you did
that's a
pray about it.
scary place to be in. And
It was
yeah, and you can think you
predetermined.
prayed about it, you can think you were open to it, but you already
Right.
knew what you wanted. And
Well, that's always
how
a good
many
reminder. That is always a really important reminder, because there are many times in the scriptures where there are people who prayed and got answers they didn't really want. And I think that is just, as you say, it's just such an important reminder that um, they were open. They were open to something
they
that might
had to be.
they had
That's
to be, because if they had come in with their minds made up, and then thinking like, oh, the
there's
Lord is
no
just going to
way.
rubber stamp this because I'm going to go through the motions of prayer, then we're really blocking the chance that we have to be taught,
Yeah.
and that we're
So
not going
all
to
of that.
have the Spirit be able to work with us. So all of that is really relevant. We're going to have to save the last one. We're going to have to save the last one. Let's do it a
No.
different time, because this has been fun, but I want to be able to have plenty of time
But
to
it
talk about
ties
now.
to this. Okay.
Well, we'll tie it in. We'll tie it in.
Okay.
But this one is, this has been really fun for me, because these are things that we talk about all the time, and I'm really grateful that you call so that I have somebody to talk to. Um, all these ideas that are always coming through my mind, and I really appreciate that. And this is one that has, well, both of these have been really, really useful to me. I've really found them to be very, very useful. That the Lord, first of all, we can't limit him to our preferred love languages. We can, and I certainly have known that lesson before, but it was a timely reminder at a time where, yes, I would like to have certain things the way I would like them to be, and yet I'm willing to see God give his answers and his love to me in ways that are not what I'm looking for, perhaps, but are nonetheless tender and sweet and beautiful and meaningful if I let them be and don't bounce them off of my expectations. And then this other message has something that I just have thought about ever since you first reminded me of this part of Jacob. And honestly, it's never far from my mind as we go through this time of the world, where so many things are coming up with standards issues, but also LGBTQ stuff, all this stuff that is in the mix, where the dissensions, following the prophets, what are our feelings about the prophecy? The prophets, were they inspired by it? Anyway, all these different things that have come up. I think it's just so comforting that the Lord actually, if we take it this way, gave us the description of these times. And it can really help us feel confident that things are not out of control as they may seem. We might think, well, the Lord is just letting things, go to pot. No, he's not.
There's a plan and order.
There's a plan. There's an order. The wild and the tame growing right together, because a lot of things can happen if we work on this gathering. If we, again, we're not, I'm not saying we're not going to judge, but we're not judgmental. We're not condemning. We're not trying to cast people out, but we're patient with the process of this gathering, where, as Jeremiah, I think it's Jeremiah, I could be wrong, but anyway, one of the Old Testament prophets who talked about, the nets gathering in fish of every kind, like, all kinds of different species that God loves, all of his children. From whatever their situation and background, God wants us to invite them. And as they come in, and I've mentioned this before, my mother used to say, that these two parts of the threefold mission of the church, so to speak, are at odds. To gather everybody, because that increases the heterogeneity of the people, meaning the differences. Like, we've got saints in Africa and South America and on the islands of the sea, and North America and South America and Europe and Asia. As we're all coming from different places. We look different. We sound different. We have different backgrounds. We have different customs. But God is inviting all his children to come. And yet then one of the other parts of the threefold mission of the church, all meaning coming to Christ, right, was to become one, to perfect the saints, to become one body, to become Zion. And the more different people we bring in, the harder that is to do. but Christ can do it. Christ can do it. And for now, the wild and the tame are growing right next to each other. And we're going to get some really amazing fruit from places we might not have ever expected. And then some places where we thought maybe, these people for sure are going to bring forth wonderful fruit. And maybe they won't. Maybe they will. Some will, some won't, from every kind. And that's, I think, where we are. And the Lord is saying, like, give it time. Give it time. And as the good grow in strength, the time will come where the sifting and the pruning will begin.
And I think as things get worse, I mean, there is going to be a divide in the church. That's prophesied of, right? And
Yeah.
whenever that comes, whatever that is, I think that comes before Zion. And when we're ready to be in Zion together, it's going to be because we've gone through so many hard things that we're ready to, put down whatever like last things of Babylon that we wanted, whether it's judging other people or whatever it is. We're going to be so grateful to be around people that are like-minded and want to be of the Lord. And the Lord is going to have those standards in Zion. They have to be there. So however we get to them, it's going to be some way that we get to them. And those people that get annoyed with the people that aren't obeying everything are going to have their hearts softened. And the people that aren't wanting to obey everything are going to see like, oh, there is a reason that I need to do this. And it's going, but because of what's coming. I mean, there's no question that it's going to get harder before Zion.
Yep, it's been prophesied by every prophet. So,
one other thing that I think we should have talked about, and maybe you just need to do this another time too. But with finding God's love, I think we talked the other day about the gratitude and what our heart is made up of.
Okay, and make a note. I'm serious. Put it down, because I also want to talk about that part in Alma that I love that you noticed this year. So we're going to talk about that and put down a note for the gratitude, because I think that is a really good point. We've had some great conversations about that, and you have some really wonderful thoughts. So I'm going to thank my daughter, Caitlin Justiniano, and have to thank her husband and her kids for letting her go these times that she's come to keep me company.
Come up from Phoenix, even though you always say it's Mesa.
Oh, I do. I probably say Mesa all the time, but from Phoenix. Good year, right? So, okay. Anyway, thanks to all of you for joining us this time, and I hope that this has been something to think about, or gives you something to think about, and that it's comforting and also motivating, because both of those things would be good outcomes. As ever, thanks to my husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care. Let's see if I can turn this off.